I'd first like to introduce Eloise Burge, who is Portable's design strategist. Portable is a tech and design company located in Victoria that, as I say, does work in innovation with government. She has extensive experience in service design, user experience, research and strategy design, working on the development of the Supreme Court of Victoria's case management system. Prior to that, Eloise, it says Ellie here, but is either?
Yeah,
I'm going to go with Eloise. There will be Q&A, so you will have your choice of Eloise or Ellie as the afternoon progresses. Prior to that, Eloise worked as a commercial lawyer for 6 years. Her skill sets span service design, user experience design and research. She is one of the top 8 women in legal tech in Australia, in brackets, legal economy. Please make her welcome.
So, as Dan said, my name is Eloise, or Ellie, I have no preference, and I'm from a digital innovation design agency in Melbourne called Portable. And for those of you who were listening to Matt before lunch, we are one of those B Corps that he spoke about. So we are driven by trying to, I suppose, make social innovation a commercial reality. And we do that by working with a lot of governments and for purpose. So over the last couple of years, we've noticed, particularly while working with governments, that people encounter a lot of the same roadblocks when they're trying to innovate. And when I say innovate, I mean both internally and externally. And innovation can be something as big as trying to get a multi-billion-dollar project off the ground, or it can be something as small as trying to get green pens. It doesn't matter what you're trying to do. Anything that is, I suppose, against the norm or new or considered risky falls under the umbrella of innovation. So what we did was we went out and we spoke to over 200 people in the public service to try and identify what those common traits of an innovator in the public service were and what those barriers that they're constantly addressing are and how we could try and solve them. So we've put together a report over the last year and we've called it Hacking the Bureaucracy. And we've also identified a bunch of steps, so basically an instruction manual to help people innovate in government. And I'm going to be speaking to some of those ways that hopefully might be some tips and tricks that you can take back to help you maybe get some green pens or maybe get one of those billion-dollar projects up. So, that work? Okay. So I just want to start by saying that we believe, and I believe firmly in government. I think that you are so incredibly well placed to be able to make change, no matter what you're doing. If it's project-based, if it's policy-based, you are so primary placed to be able to do exactly what you want to do, and you're at the top of the pyramid. If there's a change that needs to get made, if it's legislative, no matter what it is, you don't have to go through the same barriers that the rest of us in the private sector have to do. You are there. So I think government often doesn't appreciate, or the rest of the public sector doesn't appreciate, the benefits that you have to innovate. So one of those people is Donald Trump. And when we put this in, or when we identified this slide last year, he's kind of proven his own point, I suppose. But that's not why we wanted to put it in there. We wanted to put it in there to prove quite the opposite. And I think everybody in this room today demonstrates that point really well, that good people do go into government. It's just there's a perception from the publics, particularly from the private sector, that that's not the case. And I'm sure you're all aware of that. You're fantastic at your jobs, you're incredibly capable, but it can be an uphill battle to get really fantastic work done and recognised. And there are ways to do that, but unfortunately it is hard to then go against perceptions like these. So there is a level of democratic satisfaction that's been decreasing over at least the last 2 decades. And that's a trend that's difficult to go against. But there are ways that we can try and do that with innovation within government. Unfortunately, when you've got a lot of deficit in the budget, it's even more difficult to do. But there are opportunities. So if you start to look at the way that people are more willing to forego decreases in taxes for an increase in public spending towards social services, we can start to identify opportunities for innovation to increase satisfaction with government. This is where it starts to get interesting. So there is a very high expectation on the level of service delivery within government. People have had so many expectations and so many services delivered to them from the private sector that anything that was once exceptional service level now becomes ubiquitous and standard. So if it was really visionary, it's now the norm and it's accepted. So unfortunately, that has to follow through into everything else that's done in the public sector. But that's not new. Government can do that, and it's probably the best incubator for these new ideas because you have the ability to be able to do things and create change that's not available to the rest of the sectors. And you've done these things in the past as well, with Wi-Fi and the national energy market being two examples. And I think it's also really important to remember that the private sector doesn't do it any better. They're potentially just better at marketing themselves. For every Facebook and Uber, there's thousands of failed startups and there's thousands of failed innovation ideas out there. So when we look at someone like Barack Obama, who's saying that the private sector doesn't have the same constraints as the public sector. So a lot of the private sector only has to be driven by the bottom dollar, whereas the public sector, the public sector has to be constrained by a lot more that isn't recognised by many people. So we can be the drivers of change. And in our experience, there's so many people who want to do that and are capable of it, they just don't have the tools available to them. So how can we start to do that? We can start to identify exactly what makes a good innovator within government. And we've identified that there are these 6 particular profile elements of a government innovator. So they're found all across the public sector at every level, and that every person within government has the power to push innovation and drive change. At a minimum, they want to benefit themselves. At a maximum, they want to benefit the community as a whole. But unfortunately, there's a lot that they've got to navigate through to make any change. So the question is, how do you navigate through the middle of this iceberg? So we've identified the term hacking the bureaucracy. So we've chosen these words hacking from the tech sector because we know that hacking relates to coders and we know that people understand what coding is. You guys know the system that you're operating in and you know that you're the insiders so that you are best placed to navigate this treacherous waters. So we also know that the qualitative and quantitative data in the Australian Innovative System report produced in 2010 demonstrates a causal link between innovation and performance measures like productivity. The OECD estimates that as much as 50% of economic growth in its member countries can be accounted for in innovation activity. So there's a huge incentive for this to be pushed through government. So, as a result of producing this report, we've identified some key elements that hopefully you'll be able to take away from today and start to implement in your daily lives if there's some things that you'd like to get up through your innovation programs. So the first of which is the power of small teams. Now, not all of these apply through every project. Some of them might depend on your own personalities, your own networks, and exactly what you're wanting to do. If it's a huge project, you might adopt a few of these. If it's a small project, only 1 or 2. If you're someone who's at the top of the pyramid, you might not need to do all of them, or you might have a different way of working. What we're hoping is that you might be able to pick and choose from these and be more successful and get things done more easily than perhaps you've had to do in the past. So the power of small teams is that it's a lot easier to get things done if you're only working with a small group of people. The bigger you make your team, the harder it becomes to manage. Different people have different voices and they want theirs heard. If you have something that's particularly important, if you have to account for a lot of voices and a lot of opinions and a lot of different stakeholders, it's going to be a lot harder to get that project up and running and through all of those different barriers, because there's going to be a lot of accountability along the way. It's like steering a ship. The bigger the ship is, the harder it is to steer. So if you can start when your project is in its infancy with just a little strong project team that you know and trust, you'll have a much better chance of success later on. And it's also important to train yourself to be a bureaucracy hacker. So this one means that it's really important that you understand your environment. So before you even start anything, understand exactly what it looks like around you. So who are the important key stakeholders? Who are you going to be accountable to? What's your risk profile? Who are the people who are going to be actually signing the checks for you? Who do you need to have on your side? Who is going to be potentially talking against you? Make sure that you understand that environment, that you've mapped it all out, that you understand each element and that you can respond to it as quickly as need be, so that if anything should get thrown in front of you, you can respond to it in a really agile way. So momentary change is really easy, but it's that lasting change that's really difficult. So before you begin, just make sure you map out that organisation, including any of the touch points, so that you're just aware. Identify your key players, assess all of your own resources, and seek out anyone else who's done anything similar. If they've succeeded or failed, you want to know exactly what happened. If they were successful, what did they do? Who did they talk to? If they'd failed, why did they fail? Perhaps it's something that's worth pursuing or it's not worth pursuing, or there's something that you can learn from so that you don't make the same mistake that they did. So create a safe space. So this is really important. I do a lot of workshops with people within the public sector, and even when we're doing theoretical projects about what we could do to improve services, one of the things I hear time and time again is you can't do that because of risk. And this is just theoretical solutions. Risk is a thing, it will always be a thing, but you need to be aware that even if that happens, what are you going to do? So create that safe space to take that risk. Have everyone around you aware that it might fail, and that's okay. You can learn from it, you can pick up the pieces. It doesn't matter what project it is. It could be something really big, as we said before, or it could just be a small little thing that you want to make an example of to see what the output is. If it's something where you want to try a new technique, if you want to perhaps try agile, if you're working in some sort of technology, or try a new process, then just start with a little project and see if it works. And if it does, fantastic. If it doesn't, fantastic as well. You've learnt something from it and nothing's been lost. It's just important that those around you are aware of what you're doing and that it is just a process that you're learning, that it's not the end of the world if it fails, and that there is that expectation that that might happen, so that if it does, you don't have to go back to your executives and explain why it's failed and that it's catastrophic, but that they're all clued in and understand that it is a learning experience. So choose a problem, not a solution. So a lot of the time you might come across a problem in your daily lives, throughout your job, that you might think that there's a better way that you can solve something. And the minute that you start thinking about, I can solve this with a particular piece of technology, you've already lost the game. So continuously think about the problem all through your project, because you're not trying to come up with a new piece of software, you're just trying to understand exactly what the problem is you're trying to solve, because it might be a problem that's a problem for other people as well, and the minute you bring that solution into the room, you've lost the ability to identify who else is suffering from it. Also, the minute you start to pick apart elements of it, you'll be faced with a lot of other people who have ideas about how they can solve it without considering actually what that problem is. They'll all have their own individual drivers about why you should be picking certain things. If it's an IT solution, they might be drivers about why people want to bring in a technical solution, or somebody else might have a driver about why they want to bring something else in. So just remember to always keep bringing it back to what the problem is, rather than just trying to bring in a quick fix. If you're chasing a solution, you're going to find something quickly, but it's not going to answer your actual problem. Always remember to be minimum and viable. So minimum and viable is a solution from the tech space, and it just means that whatever you do needs to be the smallest, the most minimalist thing that you can start with. You can have a great problem that you want to solve and a great solution, but just start with the bare bones of what you need to. You can add to it later. Every version you add to, the more bells and whistles, it's going to be more expensive, it's going to take longer to get up and running, and you don't need that. If you just want to get something out there quickly, just make it small. Just make it do the least things that it possibly needs to do to solve your problem. So if we go back to the green pen example, if you need green pens, just keep remembering you need green pens. Don't think that you need a whole box of pens with all the colours of the rainbow. That would be great, but you can add to those colours as you go, because for every change you need to make, if you get it wrong, it's going to cost you money. So there's kind of a diagram, an inverse one. Each step of the way, it gets more expensive to go back and fix it. So just get each step right and then add to them as you go. So find your co-conspirators. So I don't mean to sound conspiratorial here, but it can be really useful if this is the space that you need to be operating in to make something successful. It's just find those right people around you to make this successful. It could be that you can talk freely and openly about what you want to do, but it might be that your particular problem needs you to go a little bit under the radar. And if that's what happens, then fine. We've spoken to a lot of people, and a lot of people need to operate in this way. It just means that you find people who are going to be supportive of your problem, who aren't going to be those ones who seek to derail you at the first opportunity. They're those ones who will help to develop your idea and make it successful without throwing in the barriers before you've had a chance to really make it everything it needs to be, before you can take it to the broader group and say, how can we make this everything we need it to be? So keep it small and keep that group as a group who's going to be successful to your project. So be discretionary about that. Don't think that just because they're in my team, they're going to be the right people for me. They might be people who sit outside your team. They might be people who have done something similar in the past. It's really up to you, but it's a really worthwhile exercise to seek those people out actively and find out what they can bring to your team that's going to make it everything that you need it to be successful. Which follows on, don't be afraid to look outside. So just because you sit within one department doesn't mean that that's where your most successful team members will be. There's a whole skill set within government, and the person who sits next to you might be the most useful person for your team, or it might be the person in another department. And if that's the case, fabulous. Go and find them, seek them out. Or it might even be somebody in the public sector. So it's up to you to work out how you can make this project successful. So you need to look more broadly. Is it an issue that's going to be solved by getting people in my team because they have the best knowledge of it? Or is it going to be people who've done it before? Is it going to be people who have an understanding of what's going on in the commercial space? Is it somebody who's going to have an understanding of what's going on in the policy space? And work out how you can bring all those people together, that shared, really deep experience, to make it everything that it needs to be successful. Because it's your project, you're leading it, and if you're just drawing on a very narrow skill set, it's not going to be able to achieve everything you want it to achieve. And I think it's really important to demonstrate your successes, but equally to demonstrate your failures. So again, I mentioned before, I do a lot of work with people in the public sector, and we often talk about exactly what we would like to see. And time again, they want to understand what other departments are working on, be it a success or be it a failure. So don't be afraid to promote things that don't go well, because just because it might not have been the roaring success that you want it to be does not mean that it's not a success. If it helps somebody learn from something, or if it helps get you to the next step, it has been a useful and worthwhile exercise. Everything that we learn from is helping somebody. If it's time taken away from your job, but it's time that has progressed the department, has progressed a project that has therefore helped something down the line, it has never been a failure. All of these learnings that we can take help, and they build our skill sets. So definitely promote things that have gone well, but equally promote those things that haven't. Sit around, have shared experiences, cross those silos of government, of departments, and say, this is what we did. Is there something you've done similar? Can we learn from them? Can you say, I did this, but it didn't work. What did you do? And then how can we take both of those learnings and progress it to do something well? Beg, borrow, and steal. Again, cross those silos. Don't just sit around and live in your own little team in your own department. Make the most of the resources available to you. You're in such a privileged position that you have an amazing network around you of people, such capable, skillful people to draw on. Use that to your advantage. Everyone in this room is so highly capable and has such a deep experience and knowledge that could be beneficial to anybody's project. Use that. If it means picking up the phone, don't be afraid to do it. It will only help you. The worst that someone can say is no. And if it helps you, then you've won. Sorry. You've also got to remember that any project that you work on is going to potentially take away from your full-time job. So I remember, as Dan mentioned before, I worked on the e-filing system at the Supreme Court, and that wasn't my full-time job. That was one of my additional duties. And every time I wanted to make an improvement to that, it meant taking time away from my actual job. And it just became a really difficult process to actually get anything done. And I'm sure everybody's been in this situation. You identify a way to improve a process, but it comes at a great expense of actually getting work done. So you just kind of go, I could fix something, or I could just let it go because it's not worth it. The short-term pain, I'll just have to put up with. So you do. So you have to make that decision. Is it worthwhile to steal my own time to get something done in the end? So these are the conversations that you have to start having with people around you, your supervisors and your directors, and say, I've identified an opportunity to improve the way that we work. It's going to mean that I can't fulfill my regular duties because I'm going to have to focus on something else. And have that discussion with them and say, am I able to take certain time away from my job to improve something? It will mean that my job will suffer, but I will be able to make these improvements for us in the long run. Also, there's often a cost associated with doing these things, and more often than not, that cost comes out of discretionary spending. If that's something that people are okay with, then that's fine. But you might have to find a way to fund these ideas. But be creative in the way you do them. There's a lot of pools of money out there that you can find. There's internal grants, there's discretionary spending. Think about ways that you can solve the problem that aren't within the box. And finally, seek forgiveness, not approval. I think this is really important. A lot of people who have had successful innovation programs have just done them and then apologised later. Don't stop and think and worry, am I going to get in trouble? Is it worth it? Get all your ducks in a row, sit before your directors, make applications, sort out all the finer details, and then get shot down. If it's something that you think is worth it and it's important to you, just do it. If you're passionate about it and you believe in it, put everything you have into it, do it, and then deal with the consequences. Because if it's really what you believe it to be, it will be worth it. And it won't be a matter of having to apologise at the end, because everybody will be able to see the benefits that you've contributed to the department, and you won't be punished, you will be rewarded for having contributed something. So don't sit back and be deterred from all of the red tape and the difficulties. Just forge ahead and appreciate that it might be a long road, but it's harder to not do it. So it's worth just biting the bullet and running through it. So as Todd Park said, those who are successful entrepreneurs, in his experience, are those who are more driven by the community benefit. And I think those who are in government inherently have that trait, because we're here to serve the public. And social entrepreneurs have a special trait, because we're not motivated by self-interest. So when the going gets tough, we're not inclined to leave the room. We see things more differently, and the motivators aren't, as we said before, money and financial benefit and esteem. They tend to be the benefit of those around us. And it does make it easier when things get hard, because we can see how it's going to help the broader community. And I think that government is, as I said, uniquely placed to be able to facilitate innovation that is not in the realm of the private sector, because it is staffed with people like you who have these traits. And it's also really well placed because it can drive change that the private sector can't. It can change legislation, it can change policy, and it can really make a difference, whereas the private sector can do all at once, but it will reach a point like Uber where it will come across legislative hurdles that will stop it in its tracks. So the public sector and government is ripe for innovation. And I think recognising that and not being afraid to take chances, and putting risk aside and creating those safe spaces, finding our co-conspirators, looking outside, recognising that innovation is not a dirty word, is something that's going to be really beneficial. So I think right now you're the best placed people in the world. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I read the Hacking the Bureaucracy report again, obviously in the lead up to this session. I've read it a couple of times since Tim Ayres has sent it to everyone on the planet a number of times. And I really do recommend it to everybody in this room, especially if you have a digital copy of the report. It has a lot of very useful links, covers off a lot of what Eloise has talked about, but there's a toolkit at the back end as well. And as someone who's worked in this space for the last 10 years, as I think everybody in this room has, it's constantly the basics where we get tripped up. It's the basics we have to return to. It's the basics we often have to discuss. So as we come to questions, I'm sure a lot of people here will have a lot of examples about where their projects have come unstuck, or in fact moved through a lot of the issues that Eloise has raised. So I encourage you to give that some thought. Our next speaker is probably known to you, he's known to me. Matt Ryan from the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. The Australian Centre for Social Innovation, as I say, is one of the nation's leading organisations in social innovation. It's established here in South Australia by the former Premier Mike Rann as an outcome of having Jeff Mulgan from the UK, who originally visited South Australia in 2006 to talk about the public value framework he developed for then Prime Minister Tony Blair, and his thinker in residentship, if that's what it's called, focusing on social innovation. And we have him to thank for the very excellent Australian Centre for Social Innovation. Matt Ryan's recently joined TACSI, and I'll vouch personally for the following dot points, which I'll read in no particular order. Matt is an experienced public policy and communication strategist. He has worked with leaders in government, NGOs, universities and business to build policy environments that enable change to be created and sustained. Combining skills in strategic engagement and communications with a comprehensive knowledge of public policy and government, Matt's approach helps organisations to facilitate considered stakeholder and public evaluation of new responses to challenging policy questions. Before joining TACSI, Matt was Deputy Chief of Staff to the South Australian Premier, Jay Weatherill, advising on a wide range of policy areas, including strategic engagement and communication, intergovernmental relations and climate change. He is passionate about making change for and with the people affected by it, particularly those here in South Australia. Please make Matt welcome.
Thanks, Dan. Just a couple of formalities perhaps before I start. I just wanted to acknowledge that we meet today on the lands of the Kaurna people and we acknowledge their special relationship with the land. An apology too for my co-presenter who couldn't make it at the last minute today, and also just an apology as well for someone else who's been a really important part of the project team of the project that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about today, and that's Chris Vanstone, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at TACSI. So I want to sort of acknowledge those guys because a lot of what you're about to see is really the product of our joint work and the discussions we've had with a number of people in the public sector. And really the success of that work when we take it forward is going to depend a lot on people like you in the room. You're going to be our co-conspirators, to put it in the language that Ellie has. And just picking up on something that Ellie said right at the beginning, I think she sort of said the broader context about this thing, this whole topic of innovation in government and sort of fitting in with trust in government and questions of trust in government. And I remember when I was looking at this a couple of years ago, there were two things that stood out for me, two kind of facts that stood out for me. One was a survey that Edelman, which is a major sort of public relations agency in the world, puts out every year, called the Trust Barometer, and it had trust in government in the trust in government in Australia from the general population. It was at 37%. By international standards, actually not too bad, but gives you a sense it's less than half. And then, perhaps a bit more amusingly, I saw a survey done by Reader's Digest about the least most trusted professions. And they had, the least 50 trusted professions. And politicians, I think, came in out of that 50 at about 48. And they were, I remember noticing this, they were lower than sex workers and insurance salespeople. So that tells you something about the context and where we start sometimes when we're trying to work with the broader community. It's really, really tough work, and that's why you confront so many challenges in your daily work. Just a little bit of context about the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. And this presentation really, I just want to, that's how we work. We do things in the office where we do some desktop research, analyse different materials that are out there, make some assumptions about things, and then we go out to the real world and start testing them and find out, is that true here in this setting, in this situation at this time? And we do this in a loop. We do lots of this through our projects. We go in and out, in and out, in and out all the time to really test what is actually true. And so as we go through this presentation, I want to be able to, I'm going to sort of share with you what we've found in terms of looking at a public sector innovation lab for South Australia, which is kind of the brief we've been asked to look at. How might that assist, or the thinking of those sorts of things, how that might assist South Australian public sector to sort of catalyse a new wave of public sector innovation and deal with some of the really big challenges we've got. But also just to show you some of the approaches that we're using in thinking about that work, so you maybe start to reveal for you some of the things you might find useful in your work. As I say, the success of the work is only going to be achieved in partnership with many of you in the room. And sort of the basic structure I'll go through, I guess, is I'll sort of start to tell you a bit about some of the global things. Well, first of all, some of the context, just confirming that with you guys, some of the context that you work in now at a high level. Some of the things that are going on at a global level, which is where we started, to go out and just have a look at how are people dealing with the really big challenges, and then bring it down to some of the very local research and start to share with you some of the findings of the research and some of this in and out kind of process that we've been going through. First of all, I'm sure everybody's heard this, South Australia is the testbed state, a place where you can come and test out your ideas to try and drive a new wave of innovation and investment in this state. So that's one sort of broader context that we're in. And in a sense, it's really giving from the kind of the highest possible level a sense of permission about innovation. You're saying it's okay to go and do it, to have a go. And I do remember the Premier in a speech from a couple of years ago where he actually said, look, we're going to do these things and some of them are not going to work. And that's going to be okay, but we're going to have to try if we're going to reach to this new future, this thing that we kind of aspire to in this room. So I think that's just one sort of high-level piece of context. The other one is we're not starting from zero. There's lots of things going on in the South Australian government at the moment that are really good. And I've had good fortune to travel to see some of the work being done overseas. And I tell you, the work that's being done in South Australia stands at least on par with a lot of that work. Sure, there's always things we can learn, but don't be afraid to think about the things you're doing here can stand up on a global stage. They really, really can. And people are actually very, very interested when they hear about what's happening here in South Australia. And that's attracting a lot of interest in what we're doing. And so they're just some of the things that are going on that get some recognition more widely. It's by no means everything. They're just some of the things across government. Change at South Australia, the 90-day projects, the Better Together program, the GovHack and the data, open data, thinking about digital service delivery, all sorts of things like that. And interestingly, one that's perhaps just emerged more recently, the joined up policy work. So really thinking about how do we break these silos and work across government on policy issues. And this one too, I just thought a little bit more context, like perhaps something that doesn't exist in a lot of other places is a really strong grounding in the legislation. I just sort of went through the Act and had a look and just pulled out some of the phrases that are in there. It says you can actually do some of these things, you can be innovative, and you're actually complying with the law, basically. The Commissioner, Emma Ranieri, has actually tried to make this come to life through the behaviours and values frameworks, the public sector behaviours and values framework. And so it's just another thing you can kind of rest back on. So with all these permissions in place, the question does kind of arise, well, why is it so hard? Why doesn't it happen? Why is innovation really hard work? And I thought of this. It's, as has been pointed out in the report that Ellie's spoken about, in the public sector you're subject to public scrutiny, the tolerance for failure is low, and I think there's a really important point to reflect on there. There's often good reason for that tolerance of failure to be low. You are dealing with really important issues, in many cases that involve people's safety and well-being, and they're not things to throw away lightly and to test and trial, and no wonder no one wants to be a guinea pig in that sort of situation. And so there's sort of a bit of a sense that emerges as a result of that, though, that is sort of first do no harm, and so that sort of acts as a bit of a brake on making really innovative change. But I think we can start to challenge that, and I think, given the fact you're all in the room here today, you're the people who are starting to and I don't expect you to read all of those stats up there, but it just gives you a sense, and no doubt you'd think of many more, that can we really be claiming to be doing no harm by not doing anything about these things and really trying to shake these things up? That's kind of the philosophy that's underpinning the project that the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment has given us. So one of the first things we did was, ask ourselves, how is the rest of the world dealing with this kind of a challenge, these sorts of challenges? One thing that has happened in the last few years is this sort of explosion in public sector innovation labs or social innovation labs. And there's just a few of them there, including us, the Auckland Co-Design Lab in New Zealand. Some are in government, some are out of government, some are philanthropically based, some are financially self-sustaining. And all of those various models kind of have pros and cons. So there's no one fixed, agreed, set solution for dealing with these things. And and this is a slide, and I just want to acknowledge the work. This is coming from work done by the University of Melbourne and Emma Blomkamp, who works in their policy lab, who looks at these things around the world. And it just shows you the growth of labs over time, and you can start to see like the big explosion in about 2011 of these things, interest really starting to peak in different ways of doing things. And so this is what we're really wanting to start to tap into. And what are these things doing around the world? Well, as we've heard, they're really trying to create dedicated spaces for collaboration, places where it's safe to experiment, where you test before you invest, and they deal with these wicked problems. And that's this article from the advertisers in the paper today, talking about the South Australian health system and the wicked problems in it. And this is what these are the sorts of things these labs are trying to deal with. I'm going to ask you a question at this point. What do you think is happening here? I'll just preface it a little bit, and I want you to give me some words to describe what's happening. Just 1 or 2 words. This was a photo shared with us by Andrea Siodmok, who's the head of Policy Lab in the United Kingdom Cabinet Office. And she ran a workshop in sort of design methods and experiments and testing, and gave them an exercise that said, what you have to do is, I'm going to give you some spaghetti, and you have to see if you can stack it as high as you can. And so here's a group of public sector workers trying to stack spaghetti as high as you can. Can anyone just give me some descriptive words to describe what's going on here, what they see? What would you use? What would you say is going on? No, this is not the marshmallow challenge, but this is the spaghetti challenge, I think it was, a variation on, yeah? Any other words? Like, what do you think about it? Is it a good idea, a bad idea? Are people working together? Yeah. 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 Yeah.
It looks like a bad idea, whatever it is.
Looks like a bad idea? Yeah? Yeah? Good. Okay, so there's a few things going on here that occurred to Andrea when she was doing this. One is, and just think about this, are these words that normally associate with public sector professionals. There are people working together. There are people who are collaborating. These are people from different parts of government. You wouldn't know in that context. They're doing something quite different, innovative. How do you stack spaghetti? Well, that's interesting. And I think sort of the lady who's sort of over here on the left, and she's got her hand on her head. I think that's Dan's point about it's a bad idea. It looks dangerous, right? Wow. Are these words you normally associate with the public sector? No, they don't do dangerous things. They're all wearing cardigans sitting behind desks, right? So there's I just wanted to put that to you because this was really sort of leads us to a really interesting point about we can't just sort of throw in to the public sector, go and be innovative and expect dangerous things not to happen, especially because of the work that you do. And so we talk about this at TACSI as why we name our assumptions and want to go out and test them, and we want to do it early and we want to do it small, as Ellie was saying. We want to do it early on so we manage all of the risks, control all of the risks, we don't let dangerous things happen at any great scale, and we don't waste money. And so as you can see, you let things drift for too long and you let the project get too big, it gets very expensive and very embarrassing and perhaps even dangerous to make changes. So when we went to look at around the world, we sort of really focused in on these 4 global labs. Policy Lab UK in the Cabinet Office there, Mind Lab, which is from Denmark, Public Policy Lab, those first 2 are actually in government, and so is CoLab, which is in Alberta, Canada. Public Policy Lab, which is New York, which is actually one that sits on the outside of government and is completely self-sustaining. And we tried to learn trying to find out what could we learn from them and bring into the South Australian context. And again, look, there's probably a little bit of repetition here with what Ellie was saying, but there's sort of a couple of sort of things that we noticed. Obviously, labs is physical space. This is Mind Lab, something like the space shuttle there on the left. Really, I don't think we're getting one of those here. But that was kind of the early version and early thinking about these things. And MindLab itself was actually starting to shift away from that. What they're starting to look a bit more like now is this. Neutral pop-up spaces that might happen in your agency, your department, your coffee meeting room, whatever. Enabling people to get involved very quickly, very easily. And it's what we found in some of our research is there's been some resistance to the idea of a sort of a central institutional kind of all-knowing lab. There's sort of a resistance about that, sort of sending messages down to people in agencies. In fact, it's about creating spaces for people in their own contexts and giving them support to do this kind of innovation work. And if you're interested, you can go and actually have a look at MindLab. It's probably a bit small there, but if you Google MindLab and the 6 evolutions of MindLab or 6 stages of MindLab, you'll find some information about how they've changed over the years from the very central thing to something that's trying to be a bit more distributed. They all use, all of these labs we found, all use very similar kind of methods, user-centred insights, prototyping. You can read these for yourself. They're all things that I'm sure to one degree or another you have some familiarity with. But fundamentally what they're doing is setting out an innovation process, and this is the one, how we describe the one at TACSI. We say it's about taking ourselves from the unknown to the known through a process of discovery, design, trialling and spreading. And the thing we observe about lots of government projects is that they often start in that trialling phase. Your traditional pilot starts out there. And we miss some of the discovery and we miss some of the design. And that's not necessarily the fault of people like you in the room, right? Sometimes you're gifted solutions from either a knee-jerk reaction in the political realm or a knee-jerk reaction in the community, or some other sort of cost pressure or something that forces you to do something. And so it's thinking about how can we respond better in those kinds of situations and understand where we're sitting and the pros and cons of being in that space and the implications of being in one of these stages. So what did we do in South Australia? One of the first things we did after sort of doing some desktop research was actually going out and talking with chief executives. They're kind of really important people to create the conditions for you to do the innovation work you need to do. And we kind of, based on all the things we saw internationally, all the different methods, all the different tools, we kind of put them into just a card sorting exercise, which is a sort of a design research methodology, and just put them out there, and as well as asking them about which ones of the things, when they're trying to do things differently, which ones of these things really appeal to you and seem really useful and really helpful. So we went through a bit of an exercise like that with them. Some of the basic sort of points that came back were, look, there are high-level observations from looking at the research we had where there are really complex kind of challenges where it's difficult to begin to know how to address them. So if I've got, responsible for dealing with mental health, I know I've got to work across silos. I know that the problem is deeply complex. I know that I've got an incomplete picture of the world, but I just don't even know where to start to pull this thing together. A really interesting thing about sort of the cultural norms. So you see these very high-level kind of permissions to go out there and take risks and be innovative. And you hear that a lot from the top. And we've, I heard chief executives saying, I really want my people to just go out there and take risks and I'll defend them. If they're trying to make a difference and they've been sensible about it, then, I'll back them in. Don't worry, if something goes wrong, that's okay. But it's from the message from when you try and go to that sort of next layer of people down who are trying to do that work, they're battling the bureaucracy, they're battling processes, and sometimes they just don't have the tools, right? Some of the capabilities that are needed, some of the things that we've seen internationally, the access to those is not easy to get. And a very sort of couple of very high-level messages as well that came through as well from the leadership in particular. We're really interested in accelerating things and we're really interested in building the capacity of our staff. So that's a really kind of important point that we can build on, that they're actually willing to think about how to do this with you and support you to do it. So what we did then, so that was sort of 1 week talking to chief executives, and we tried to demonstrate, and what I'm trying to uncover for you here is a bit of the process that, and the way you might work. We did some prototyping. So we made out that based on what everyone told us, these are kind of some service offers and that you might want, and we mocked up some brochures, and we went back to them and said, would you buy this? Which things would you buy? What would you pay for? What do you like? What don't you like? And it's kind of the act of doing it quickly, getting back to them really quickly and showing that you're making progress and getting momentum. But 2, also the actual act of making helps you learn more things than just talking about it. 1, when you're creating these sorts of things, and 2, when someone else is interacting with them. All the non-verbal cues you can pick up are really, really important. And then we sort of, within that, this is sort of the full range of offers or the roadmap or whatever you might call it. This is giving you a sense of 4 stages across which there are opportunities, we think, to support innovation in the South Australian public sector. And it's not, it's probably a fairly familiar process. It's learning some of these new methods. It's about when you've got a project, exploring what type of a problem have I got here, which tools and what's the approach that's going to be right, who needs to be in the room, it's very easy to meet with the usual suspects. It's very easy to know I've got to meet with Treasury and I've got to meet with DPC and I've got to meet with certain people in certain levels. But who are the other people that are going to be really interesting to find? And I think Ellie touched on some of that. And just to give you a sense of, there's sort of a whole heap of different sort of apply offers, right? What sort of approaches can we apply? What sort of tools can we apply? And they range from even just something as simple as how do we get better at making decisions or empowered to make decisions at lower levels to speed things up. Future thinking and strategic foresight as opposed to traditional ways of thinking about strategic planning, especially when you have to imagine a very new and different future. Problem grounding, which is really about combining kind of human-centred design and insights from that with data to get a really rich picture of what's going on. This kind of piece around testing assumptions and being really clear about it. I assume if I do this, then X, Y, and Z will happen. Well, let's go and find out if that's true in the real world. And you can do that quite quickly, and it's by using that kind of approach that Ellie talked about, that minimum viable product, being really clear about what is the key thing you want to know and just testing for that. And then some others there, but it's really kind of the other ones that were really important for people were, when I've got a solution, how do I get it to grow? And how do I get it to transition from kind of my little pilot kind of project to the bigger system? But also how, for chief executives, how if that's going well in one space, or some innovation work is going well in one space, how do I get it to be sort of infectious and across my whole department? And how do I get it to be kind of specific to my circumstances? So if you're in the Department of State Development, what your sort of innovation hub and space might be might look and feel a bit different to what it is in Department for Communities and Social Inclusion, for example. It might not, but there are probably going to be some significant differences. And so what we're doing now, we're just sort of finalising this piece of work, so it's still in progress, this work. We're looking at sort of, when we're sort of comparing what people told us, and they kind of designed, effectively, the people we spoke to designed that kind of set of offers. We compared it to what was available for people now in the public sector. These are the kinds of issues that arose, that some things were really heavily focused on getting buy-in, but we're a bit weaker on testing. I mentioned the one about strategic foresight and planning, problem grounding. Another really important one, a common evaluation framework, and really being able to understand what impact do we make and be able to measure that against other things and projects, and understanding what value was created and understanding how to capture that value, because that might be really, really important to be able to reinvest in the innovation process and make the whole innovation approach sustainable. And the point about embedding and spreading, which I've just mentioned. So right now we're going through a series of sort of analyses, final steps of a series of analyses to really think about, well, how do you operationalise this? We're using tools like a theory of change, service experience design, and here you can see the business model canvas, which is really going to the heart of how do you make this thing, what are the key activities, how do you make it financially sustainable, and what's the experience going to be like for people who want to use this kind of a lab or this kind of a service. And I think this part is really, really important because I'm sure you will have experienced that resources, the capacity that is put into innovation work fluctuates, as does kind of the authorisation to do it. So if you think about that public value framework, both of those things are variable and fluctuate over time, and I'm sure everybody's got examples of that. And just really a closing thought and a high-level observation, which we'll do a little bit more thinking about before we finally report on this. But it's really just to think about, oops, I've gone backwards. There are different types of change. And where we see it is really when the vast body of government is sort of grinding away at getting the business of the day done, the performance engine. And what we're talking about here is this innovation engine. What's creating the innovation engine? What's going to be the big disruptive thing that comes in and changes that? And importantly, what's the interface? How do you make the jump from the thing here in the innovation engine to the big performance engine? And what we're starting to form up in our heads is the idea that performance management is really about, you can do innovation in all of these spaces. Performance management is really about more continuous improvement in business process. And then on existing things, change, then there's sort of a piece of work around change management where the kind of, you know what the problem is, you've got a pretty good idea what the solution is, and really the battle is about winning hearts and minds, and what's that change management process that needs to take place. And then what we're really talking about here today is this idea of innovation where, gee, the problem's really hard to understand. I'm not even sure I've fully got the whole picture, and I have to create a totally new solution. And so that's a really different kind of thing. I'm going to need a really different kind of set of conditions to work in. I'm going to really need a different kind of set of resources and capabilities to help me to do that. And so that's just something perhaps to bear in mind and be conscious of in your work and some of the different contexts. Anyway, I look forward to reporting on this again soon. Just want to say thank you to Dan, his team in the Office for the Public Sector, and the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment, Emma Ranieri, for being bold enough to do this work. It's really, this lab and this piece of work is an effort at hacking the bureaucracy itself, and I really hope that you can all be a part of it in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. I'll come up here just in case the mics down there aren't working. So I'm going to open it up to the floor at any time anybody wants to ask questions or make comments or any observations about their own work. Please feel free. I should have pointed out right at the start of my introduction. My name's Dan, by the way. I didn't introduce myself. Pleased to meet you all. Irma's office, as she mentioned in her speech at the start of the day, is working with TACSI on the development of an innovation lab business model for South Australia. And Matt's been speaking about that, and you've seen that with that 4-stage model for what it is that we're currently looking at, and that will be piloted with projects over the next couple of months. And really the work that we've heard from Eloise sets a fundamental background to that. But Matt, let me ask you a question. Eloise, I'm interested in your opinion as well, particularly in terms of what you say that the government is well set up for this sort of work. If government is well set up, why do we need an innovation lab? I know it's a tough one, but let's go with it. Why do we need an innovation lab? What does it give us that we don't already have?
Yeah, look, I think, can people hear me? Look, my observation would be that it's really an evolution, that there is something of this nature already in existence, and I mentioned some of those before. But there are gaps in the work that we found, and some of those I just spoke about around testing, around really being able to think about the financial models that can go with this, particularly in this financially constrained environment. So, because interrupted kind of innovation work is forever going to just take you so far, and then you're going to have to go back to the beginning again, and you're going to have to do lots more hacking the bureaucracy. And perhaps we're a bit too idealistic, but we'd like to think that one day where you wouldn't have to hack the bureaucracy, this would be it. This would be the norm, the way of operating. And so I'd argue that this is why we need it. We want to model a new way of working. We want to give permission for people to do things, but we want to enable them to do it very safely.
I'd agree. In my experience, most of the federal government departments now have their own innovation labs, and I think they're a fantastic testing ground for these kinds of projects to get up and running. But they solve a lot of problems, but they're also a great testing and improving ground, but they're also a way to share skills and for people to learn. So if you have an idea, you can go there, you can get upskilled, be involved in a project effectively on a secondment, get taken out of your job, then go back and take all of those skills that you've learned back to your team and then train them up on what you've learned. So it's a great way to kind of learn and share skills, but also, I suppose, centralise a project in an innovation lab so that it's the central source of all of innovation, new skills, all that new knowledge is being funneled through a central place in a department rather than coming through disparate sources as people go off and learn in different areas. So I might come through and have done a course on the weekend on a different topic, but then there's no real way for me to share that with the rest of the department. But these labs are a great way to do that, and then people can come and have their lunchtime seminars and learn great things and take them back and share them. So I think the lab is a great place for innovation projects, but it's also a great place to learn and share that learning with the rest of the department.
So Portable is doing work at the moment with Department of Innovation and Industry, is that right? Sorry. In your organisation is currently doing work with the Department of Innovation and Industry to help them set up an innovation program, is that right?
We did that last year, yep.
Okay,
So
what can you tell us about that? What was the nature of that work?
Yep, so we worked with the Department of Industry, the federal department, to create an internal innovation pathway, so an internal ideas pathway. So if somebody had an idea for an internal project, so not an external one, but what would they do to get that idea up and running? Because I'm sure, like many of you know, if you have an idea about the way to change the way you work, there's 1,000 different ways that you can go about getting that done. So they had a formal way of getting that done, but very few people knew about that formal process. It was really just a series of workarounds depending on your position, your level of networking, your level of enthusiasm, and we worked with the department to co-design a pathway to really just codify the way that everybody could share their ideas and validate them as well. So one of the things we learned very quickly was that once you have an idea, you don't then just go and share it with everyone, you validate it amongst your peer network. And there's also a step where you also try and determine if it's been done before, learn from those around you. So we put a whole series of steps in to try and give people give them the opportunity to do what they were doing informally in a formalised pathway. So we took learnings from the ATO and other departments that had done similar things to create a whole environment rather than just a way that they could effectively create what we called our letterbox to dump ideas in and then have nothing happen to them, which is what happened in a few of the departments we learned. So we worked with different people from different levels in different areas of the department to understand exactly what they were doing and then optimise that process by co-designing and testing a process with BizLab, who were in their infancy, who were their innovation lab, to create an innovation pathway that would meet the needs of everyone across the department regardless of the size of their project or their standing in the department. So it would work from a grad who had no social capital to a director who had a lot of social capital.
So one of the concerns that I think people have around innovation labs and in many ways working with consultancies generally is that the skills and the capabilities around innovation remain externalised, and we don't build it into organisations. I wonder what your views are around that matter. Might start with you.
Sure.
And what you think the challenges are for organisations in terms of helping to download at that embedding phase that we talk about at the end of the business model.
Yeah. So you might have noticed on the when we had the 4 stages kind of model up there with all the different offers on it, kind of at the core of it was this idea of project coaching. So it wasn't the idea that somebody comes in, does the consultancy work, walks out, takes all the glory. It was really the idea that there's somebody who's available for people to help coach them through, and very focused on building the capabilities in the people and in the government more broadly. The other thing perhaps to just really emphasise is that an innovation lab doesn't mean that all the services come from outside. There already are all of the things that I've talked about, whether it's joined up policy, better together, 90-day projects, lots of capability, lots of good work being done there, and it's really about how can we integrate some of those things into the work of the lab. This is sort of an evolution, not a revolution. We're not pretending here we've got the silver bullet that's going to fix it. It's actually a bit of a journey and a bit of an innovation in itself. And each time somebody does this somewhere in the world, it's a new thing. And it's not going to work if we just simply copy what someone else is doing. And so the government itself might make choices about the capabilities it wants to build in-house and which capabilities it wants to buy in from time to time. And one thing I know in the South Australian government that they've started to build some capability in is the idea of an Office for Data Analytics, for example. So that's one area the government's looking at building some capability. There are some others around community engagement and the 90-day project process. So there's a number of ways, either directly building it or making sure that when we set the lab up, we build into the model of it this idea of kind of project coaching and making sure the transfer of skill and capability is there. And I think Ellie pointed out a really good point about labs, to the extent that they are an institution, that they're about capturing learning and knowledge and what works here so that can be shared across multiple projects.
Yeah, I'd agree completely. I think one of the key roles, as much as facilitating projects, is also facilitating the sharing of knowledge. So every project that we work on is also coaching, and that's a key part of it. But I think that comes through inherently in the nature of the work that we do. It's all very collaborative. So whether you intend to learn, I think you get drawn on the journey, because so much of it is workshop based when you are doing kind of co-design and human-centred design, that you inherently pick up the skills and you take them back and you share them with others. And I think a lot of what we do is getting, I think, spread throughout government departments anyway. It's now becoming a key facet of projects and the way that people look at them, is that kind of human-centred design innovation piece. So it's not necessarily, I suppose, alien to projects anymore. So I think the piece about where do consultants fit in is a really valid consideration, because there's a piece of the puzzle where we shouldn't exist, but I think there is also the it also does sometimes help to have an external source come out and potentially validate some things rather than coming from inside. So that can also be a useful leveraging tool.
Okay. Tim, did you have a question? You've got a minute. There's a clock flashing at me like a James Bond film down here. It's on now.
You may have just answered the question, but I'll ask it anyway. I mean, is there a danger here that an innovation lab, I guess, becomes a filter for innovation? And everybody says, "Oh, well, if you're going to innovate, off you go to the lab," and there's a filter by capacity, but also, I guess, its own bias and assumptions. So, just perhaps if you can talk about that and perhaps the experience with the feds.
Yeah, sure. So it's a really interesting point, and I think. For people who are thinking about that issue, really going to have a look at the evolution of MindLab. When we did our global scan and did some interviewing with people in those places and visiting those places, the director of MindLab actually said the first thing to think about when you're going to create a lab is don't create a lab. That were his words. And precisely for those kinds of reasons. And that's why I was trying to give that flavour of, the space shuttle-like MindLab that started to this kind of neutral pop-up space that exists out there in agencies. So this is much more about a network and the kind of connectivity across government in that very network sense. And in a very, very pragmatic sense, that if the conditions for innovation aren't going to be fully mature, if you're going to have to be go incognito or anything like that, the stronger those connections across the system are, means the sort of innovation work is going to be able to survive the fluctuations in the authorising environment and in the investing environment for innovation. I hope that gets closer to your question.
I think my perspective is a lot of these innovation labs, particularly in Australia, are they're in their infancy, and I'm not sure what they look like long term, but I think at the moment, when they start, all projects go through them. So there's not really a discretionary issue about who you take. Well, I suppose there is, but that's not so much of an issue. I think as they grow and they get older and more established, the intention is that people have the skills that they can start being self-sufficient, and it just becomes more of, I suppose, the complex projects that go through them. But potentially the intention is that the labs don't need to be there long term, because the skills will have been able to spread throughout the departments so that it's not so foreign. But then they can also, I suppose, change in terms of what they're delivering and what they're offering, so that it's not the current offering. It could be whatever happens to be progressive at the time. So just because it's an innovation lab delivering this particular skill set at the moment doesn't mean it's going to be what it delivers in the future. I think what's going to be important for innovation labs is that they stay relevant and that they stay on top of trends and are able to service the needs of their users, who are the department, which I don't think is a challenge that they've necessarily had to deal with yet, but I think it is something that they will hit maybe in 3 or 4 years' time, when the skills that they're currently specialising in do become more, I suppose, industry standard.
And I think, Matt, just to close up, one of the things we didn't talk about in terms of the business model of the Innovation Lab is ways in which the lab itself would be evaluated to evolve over a period of time. Right. and meet the needs as they evolve. And certainly from my perspective as someone who's been working with TACSI and in terms of the development of this, and having worked, as I said, in reform for 10 years, one thing that's really been required is that we have something that operates in the middle of government that's able to start to deal with those issues really from the ground up. We've got the 90-day projects that Alex works on, which is so effective at taking some of those early, the very early stage initiatives and early stage projects and taking them to that point where it's irreversible and we've got some momentum. But how do we start to deal with those complex burning issues that are really still quite formless, but we can all come together taking on projects like programs like Working Together and providing an active space and an action space. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. I'm not here to give comment, but I did it anyway. Thanks everyone for being part of this session. Thanks in particular to Matt and Eloise for joining us and presenting to us. Please give them a round of applause. Jeremy. Afternoon tea, if I'm not wrong, Renee, and no doubt it'll be where every other meal has been this today. Thanks very much, and see you later.